Have you ever imagined yourself standing before a majestic medieval castle? Massive columns, huge gates, a stone wall that made you feel the grandeur of the place. The first impression is always one of power, wealth, and unattainable status. Right, but wait a second. What you don't know is that this whole image was one big act. Castles were actually one of the greatest marketing tricks of all time, designed to impress and deceive. From the outside they looked magnificent, almost mystical, a symbol of strength and class. But what was hidden behind those stone walls was a game of prestige and appearances. Medieval castles weren't what most people imagined. They weren't palaces of luxury and well-being. There were no marble bathtubs, Persian rugs, or windows with views of bucolic landscapes. In fact, they were more like makeshift fortresses, built for survival. But with a rich facade, the design was meticulously planned to project an image of power. But the reality behind that facade was far less glamorous. The walls and towers served to fend off invaders, but they also hid a cramped, dark, and risky space. Now, imagine that in a castle where you'd think nobility lived like kings and queens. They were actually battling the same hardships as peasants. The biting cold in the winter, lack of privacy, and the poor hygiene conditions were much more present than any glorious image. So, while you marvel at the appearance of an imposing castle, remember, it was a setup to show status. And the real living conditions inside were far harder than any of us could imagine. Now that you know the castle's appearance was more facade than reality, get ready for another shock: baths. Yes, you heard that right, baths. Something we consider essential for our hygiene today, but that in the Middle Ages was avoided as if it were the plague. Believe it or not, the medieval nobility, who seemed to live in a world of luxury and pomp, had a very complicated relationship with cleanliness. Bathing wasn't a common practice, and when it happened, it was viewed with great suspicion. The reason: medieval medicine believed that hot water opened your pores, making your body vulnerable to diseases. Imagine the heads of nobles hearing that. It's almost as if they believed that simply washing your body would invite diseases in, instead of a nice relaxing bath. What they did to stay clean was change their linen undergarments frequently, and believe me, this was considered the peak of hygiene at the time. They would change their linen shirts as often as they could, sometimes even daily if they could afford it. This fresh linen absorbed sweat and oils from the skin. But in the end, the feeling of freshness was an illusion. The real dirt stayed hidden under layers of heavy clothing which barely saw soap. And to make matters worse, these nobles with all their luxury were infested with lice and fleas. And yes, everyone was in the same boat. It wasn't a sign of poverty. It was a universal problem at the time. Sometimes they would sit together and pick lice from each other's hair, as if it were a casual social activity. Now imagine that. Instead of soap and hot water, what they used to mask the smell of all this was a heavy perfume, often made with imported spices. Hard to imagine, right? A nobleman using rose and clove perfume to mask the stench accumulated over weeks, or even months. It was like a kind of medieval deodorant, but with such intensity that often people around them couldn't even get close without complaining about the smell. When the nobility's scent surpassed even the peasants and their open sewers, you know things were really bad. Now that you know medieval nobles were far from smelling like roses, let's take a look at how they tried, not so successfully, to mask the unbearable smells of their lack of hygiene. The most common solution for this was the use of perfumes, oils, and imported spices. But believe me, it wasn't as simple as it sounds. Picture this: in a medieval castle, the idea of being fresh meant covering up the smell of sweat, dirt, rotting food, and even feces with a mix of spices like clove, rose, cinnamon, and even musk. Seems like an exaggerated solution, doesn't it? But for the nobles of the time, it was a matter of social survival. After all, in such a hierarchical society, being fragrant was part of their status. But the perfumes used were nothing like the ones you find in stores today. They were dense, heavy, and often so strong that they could be smelled from meters away. And what seemed to be a touch of sophistication and luxury actually only served to mask the reality. The smell of filth was so ingrained in people's clothes and bodies that, in many cases, perfumes weren't enough to hide the grime. Imagine a noble walking through their castle wearing layers and layers of clothes, all soaked with the smell of months of dirt, and trying to cover it up with rose and clove perfume. Not exactly what you see in the movies, right? And if that wasn't enough, perfume and spices had a rather bizarre side effect. The nobles, who used these scents to mask the stench, often became the target of jokes among fellow courtiers. Historical records say that due to their strength, perfumes would become so overwhelming that other courtiers would politely ask them to step back because the smell was unbearable. Picture the scene: a noble, who should be a symbol of class and power, finds themselves forced to step away from their peers because of their own odor. Instead of maintaining an air of elegance and sophistication, they found themselves in an extremely embarrassing situation. Now that we've talked about the perfumes and spices trying to mask the odors of medieval nobility, it's time to face the harsh truth. The castles were infested, and I'm not talking about just ordinary rats or common insects. Fleas and lice were the real companions of medieval nobility, and there was no escape. What you need to understand is that the life of a medieval noble wasn't just a matter of superficial hygiene problems. The issue was that the living conditions inside the castle created the perfect environment for these tiny but relentless creatures to thrive. And to make matters worse, these parasitic infestations weren't just temporary annoyances. Fleas and lice brought with them devastating diseases that spread rapidly among the medieval population. One of them, the plague, was responsible for wiping out large portions of the European population. The bubonic plague, transmitted by fleas from rats, could kill within days. And the reality of the time was that even the nobility was constantly at risk. Even those who had the best medical care available were still vulnerable to these epidemics, as the sanitation system and lack of basic hygiene were the real invisible enemies. Furthermore, the medieval castle, with its poor ventilation system and lack of space, made the environment prone to the spread of respiratory diseases and other infections. Diseases were a constant, and no matter how much the nobles tried to hide the dirt and foul smells, there was no escaping the consequences of living in an unsanitary environment. What history doesn't tell us is that, in many cases, these diseases not only affected the servants or the peasants but also the nobles themselves, who were confined to the same poor hygiene and health conditions. Imagine the impact of this on medieval society. A noble, draped in fine clothes and expensive perfumes, but full of lice and surrounded by diseases. The idea that the castle was a place of luxury and health was pure illusion. It was a place where everyone, rich or poor, was at the mercy of nature and the diseases that spread like wildfire in dry grass. Now that we've talked about the insects and diseases that plagued the castles, let's move on to another aspect that's at least curious: medieval bathrooms. If you think things were bad in terms of personal hygiene, wait until you see what happened in the most private moments of medieval life. The guardrobes. What were the guardrobes, you ask? Well, let's go there. Guardrobes were basically medieval toilets, but far from the type of sanitary facilities you'd imagine. Instead of a comfortable enclosed bathroom like we have today, there were simply holes in external walls where waste fell straight to the outside of the castle. No running water, no sewage systems, just gravity doing the dirty work. And you know what's even worse? These holes were often not private, as we would have today. Guardrobes were in fact communal facilities where several people would do their business at the same time, sitting side by side. Imagine this: nobles, servants, knights, and even visitors sharing the same dirty and foul-smelling space, with nothing more than a small piece of wood or stone to sit on. And of course, privacy was a non-existent concept. The idea of going to the bathroom became a completely social experience, not private as we know it today. But the worst part of it all was the smell. Over time, the excrement would accumulate, and when the winds didn't help, the stench became unbearable, even for the toughest souls. And if the sewage system or cesspits overflowed, the entire castle could be flooded with the nauseating odor. Believe it or not, entire sections of the castles would become completely uninhabitable until the waste was cleared. This turned into one of the most disgusting and dangerous jobs of the time, performed by the so-called gong farmers, who were paid to descend into the cesspits and clean out the excrement. Their work was as dangerous as it was filthy, as they were exposed to toxic gases, diseases, and sometimes even drowning in the waste. And winter, well, that made everything even worse. With the intense cold, the waste froze in the pipes, and when it thawed in the spring, it created a true disaster. Mounds of excrement melting and running through the castle courtyard, turning life inside into a true nightmare of stench, filth, and contamination. Now, let's enter the medieval kitchen, the real battlefield where food was prepared for a crowd of hungry nobles. You might imagine a castle kitchen as a refined space, with chefs and helpers working in perfect harmony to prepare sophisticated delicacies. Right? Well, forget that idea. The medieval kitchen was a true controlled chaos zone, where the extreme heat and dense smoke turned the place into a gastronomic war zone. The centerpiece of the kitchen was the massive fire, so intense it could roast an entire animal in a single move. The cooks, sweaty and exhausted, wielded knives as big as swords and chopped up pieces of meat with brutal skill, while the smoke and heat engulfed the environment. But the most interesting, or the most disgusting, part of this story is how the food was preserved. Without refrigerators or refrigeration systems, what the cooks did was use extremely rudimentary preservation techniques like salting, smoking, and even embalming meats to make them last longer. But, of course, this didn't always work as expected. The meats might have been stored in underground vaults or smoked areas, but they weren't always fresh or safe to consume. What looked like a decent piece of meat could actually be a remnant of something that was already compromised. So, what did the cooks do? They relied on the old medieval technique of masking the taste and smell of spoiled meat with an abundance of strong spices and herbs. A slightly spoiled piece of meat could be turned into a gourmet medieval dish, as long as it was cooked enough and wrapped in spices and seasonings. Now, if you think food was the only problem, here's another: rats. They were a constant presence in the castle kitchens, and their attacks on grain and meat reserves were a real headache for the cooks. What did they do to solve the problem? They kept armies of cats in the castles, whose job was to relentlessly hunt these rodents. But, as you can imagine, This didn't stop the rats from continuing to show up, gnawing on whatever they could and leaving their mark everywhere. It was a daily battle between the cats and the rats, and every now and then, the rats would win. With all this chaos, the medieval kitchen was a dirty, dangerous, and unsanitary place where food was prepared amidst smoke, filth, and rats. But, for the medieval nobility, this was the best they had, and who knows, with the lack of options they probably got used to this way of life. Now, let's talk about a crucial element for human survival, but one that, in the Middle Ages, became one of people's biggest enemies: water. You might think that water was something easy to obtain, that the nobility had access to the best drinking water. However, the reality in medieval castles was very different. Drinking water was scarce, and what was available was often contaminated. For the nobles, water was often drawn from wells inside or around the castle, but these wells were far from being sources of pure water. They were frequently contaminated by sewage, food scraps, and even human waste. In many castles, the water came from poorly managed sources, and the lack of an efficient plumbing or sanitation system meant that the water would quickly become contaminated. As if that wasn't enough, during sieges, castles, which were fortified to withstand attacks, had to rely on nearby water sources, but these sources could also be contaminated by waste accumulation or lack of hygiene. During a siege, nobles often went without access to clean water for days, increasing the risk of waterborne diseases. The situation worsened with the appearance of diseases like cholera, which was spread through contaminated water. Imagine living in a medieval castle, where you couldn't even be sure the water you were drinking was safe. The water was not only contaminated with sewage, but also with diseases that could wipe out the castle's population in a matter of weeks. Even the nobility, who thought they were protected within their imposing castles, were constantly exposed to these unsanitary conditions, and they couldn't escape the consequences of such a poor water system. But there were also siege situations. During a medieval siege, castles were completely isolated, and the drinking water inside the walls didn't last long. As a result, many castles ended up contaminating their own water reservoirs, making survival even more difficult. What seemed like an unbeatable fortress suddenly became a place where living conditions were even more miserable, with both nobles and servants facing food scarcity and, worst of all, the lack of drinking water. Now, to wrap up this journey through medieval life, let's take a look at the harsh living conditions of the serfs. You've probably heard that the life of a medieval serf was tough, but what history doesn't tell you is just how unbearable it really was. For the nobles, despite all the difficulties they faced, life inside the castles had some advantages, especially when it came to food and protection. But for the serfs, the reality was a true struggle for survival. Serfs were forced to live in much more precarious conditions than the nobility. Their homes were small, poorly constructed, and often infested with bugs, lice, and rats. They were frequently forced to sleep on straw or makeshift beds, without even a clean sheet to cover themselves. Hygiene, well, that was a luxury they simply couldn't afford. Unlike the nobles, who could change their linen shirts frequently, serfs would go months without changing clothes, accumulating dirt and odor. And as we've already discussed, this attracted a multitude of parasites, which spread everywhere. Moreover, the food of the serfs was far more modest and often much dirtier. While the nobles could enjoy expensive meats, spices, and fresh food, the serfs ate whatever remained from banquets or what they could grow. Their food was simple, often based on hard bread, vegetables, and whatever they could hunt or gather. But often, the food was contaminated by insects or even rodents. And unlike the nobles, who could count on the protection of a castle, the serfs were frequently exposed to diseases and the elements. There was virtually no healthcare system for them, and any illness could be fatal. The life of the serfs was a life with few prospects. They worked from dawn to dusk in exhausting conditions, with no hope of social advancement. If you were a medieval serf, the only certainty in your life was that suffering and poverty were always by your side. And, in many cases, they died much younger than the nobles, due to poor health conditions and a lack of medical care. The truth is, while the nobles lived at the top of the social pyramid, their living conditions, however difficult, were still far better than those of the serfs, and in the end, the medieval nobility might have lived surrounded by luxuries and privileges, but the serfs paid the price of true misery and suffering, struggling to survive in a world that seemed to offer no space for those without power. If you thought medieval life was all about grand feasts and majestic castles, now you know the harsh reality that both nobles and serfs faced. Life in the past was much harder than we imagine, and understanding these dark details of history is crucial for us to comprehend the conditions that shaped the world as we know it today. If you were surprised by the discoveries about the Middle Ages, don't miss out on any more videos. Subscribe to the channel, hit the bell to never miss any content, and of course, share this video with your friends so everyone can learn the true story behind medieval castles.